what started as a prototype turned pilot has now become a standardized practice within research and development at Amgen. And so we're going to spend some time. How much time do I actually have to talk through this?
We like to leave a little bit of room. The meeting wraps up at about 5, so you've got.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, you've got time.
Okay, so I don't need to speed talk. My goal today is that we talk through sort of the framework and the understanding of categorizing process knowledge, the architecture for process design, and how that knowledge integrates, ultimately so we can reduce risk and improve search for our end users. So we'll go through that, and I'm happy to sort of deep dive into areas. Stop me at any point. I don't need to wait until the end to answer any questions. So feel free to jump in. Okay, so as a starting point, of course, we want to understand what the problem is. And this, I appreciate that this is not a unique problem. You've probably seen, Jamie, are you still watching the waiting room? I just got a note of.
Yes, I am. Don't worry about that.
Okay. Anyway, you've probably seen similar situations in your day-to-day life and in your work life. So this came up. We had an inspector a couple of years ago ask the question, how do you measure training effectiveness and performance? This was a relatively difficult question to answer. We could look at sort of the reduction of corrective and preventative action data. We could look at maybe the reduction of deviation data in our processes. We could certainly look at training completion rates and sort of hand over those numbers, but it really didn't answer the question in terms of whether training was effective and it improved performance. So I went off on a little quest to find the answer. And that, of course, I was looking at multiple sources. I was looking at what did our CAPA data, and CAPA is corrective and preventative actions. So I was looking at that CAPA data. I was also looking at LMS, our learning management system, to see sort of what was being assigned to whom and how many hours of that was that taking. And then I sent out a survey. This survey was quite telling. So I sent it off to some of our clinical development staff. The reason I targeted the clinical development staff was their processes were far more robust, pretty mature in terms of their content. And the results back were quite interesting. We have each of those individuals said there's content sort of here, there, and everywhere. It's on multiple repositories, multiple systems, and they're spending an average of 10 hours a week searching for that content or the subject matter expertise to answer questions. And 60% of the information that those individuals were looking for was not actually included in the standard operating procedure, the SOP. So, so it boiled down to our problem statement here, which is that the availability or lack thereof of the job information, it being inconsistent, it negatively affects performance. So we set off to answer the question. Sort of what do we do about that? So in order to bring this data and these disparate processes together, I needed to partner across several disciplines. So myself representing knowledge management, I brought in business process management, document management, training, IT, quality and compliance, as well as our business process owners. And collectively, we were able to identify the solution, which was we want to deliver key knowledge to the end users at the point of execution. to make process knowledge inventory both visible and usable. Okay, so before we go too much further, I want to talk about process architecture. So this is how we've organized things within R&D at Amgen. And this follows a controlled descent. So it's into 3 levels. Level 1 is, or L1, I might refer to it as, this is our business processes. This describes process ownership and governance. So we might have major categories of business processes, business process owner identified to that. Now, imagine, if you will, that you're in a system and you double click on the L1, it would drill you down into the L2. And this could be multiple L2s. So it's just a subcategorization of your business process. And these are your process areas. So this is major milestones and your trigger and end result of value. Now again, imagine that you double click into one of those L2 process areas and you get a level 3, L3. This is your executable process. This is where sort of the devil's in the details. You've got your process flows, your handoffs between roles, inputs, outputs, systems. Again, same trigger and end result of value. Okay, so now we have sort of a high level sense of what our process architecture is. We can talk a bit more about KM. I don't need to tell you what KM is. You obviously understand that. But what's interesting here is that knowledge management is identified as an enabler to the quality management system for pharma. Now, that means it works in parallel or in partnership with risk management, process, documentation, training. So this is great news. That means I can sort of meet the business where they are in terms of building a relationship between those different components. So that's what we did. Now, this depicts the KM methodology that I developed and am now using for Amgen. Some of these images are quite tiny. I promise we're going to deep dive into those, each of those, in the next couple of slides. So bear with me a little bit. But at a starting point, so over to the left, we want to baseline our as-is knowledge inventory. So this begins to categorize the content types. Again, in the next slide, I'll talk about each of those tools. And then in the middle chevron, align and optimize knowledge content for performance. So this is where we want to look at that process architecture and our inventory and understand those connection points. The last chevron, establish, monitor, and maintain plan. Just like any good project, we want to maintain and monitor. So for us, we've built that into our standard practice by using process modeling, change control, validation, and by partnering with those BPOs through maturity assessments. I'm not going to spend a ton of time there. I'm happy to answer questions, but the baseline and aligning content is really where I'm going to spend my time talking. Okay. So baseline and align process. So the table here, I'm sure you've seen variations of this. This is a knowledge map. It's a fairly common tool. I've developed this one using the APQC template and from Transcelerate. Transcelerate is a pharmaceutical consortium, and they have a process framework toolkit that I worked to author and develop. So this is something that's broadly used across pharmas. So in partnership with those BPOs, with training, with document management, which are different functional areas within my organization, we worked to create this comprehensive inventory. So we developed knowledge maps for every single process area, for all the L1s, all the L2s. So remember the process architecture. So really that was me sitting with each of them and saying, you know, questions like, when you're onboarding someone, what materials do you point them to? What resources do you give them? What are the things that people need to know to execute on the activities that are described within the process? So, like I said earlier, I want to meet the business where they are. Knowledge management, knowledge mapping, that's not perhaps part of their vernacular yet. So I wanted to categorize the content into 3 types of process-based knowledge. We have the first categories are controlled documents. These are our SOPs. These are the documents that are required and policies that describe, you know, what by law we need to do. The second is a training category. So this category could be learning activities that are inside LMS, which is a learning management system, or outside of LMS. The third category is managed information. This one's a bit more complicated because it can have sort of a look and feel of self-directed learning, but we've defined it as content that's developed and maintained by the business. And it supports process execution. So it addresses lessons learned, best practices. So a primary function of this tool is to create a visual understanding of how knowledge aligns to the processes. So where it lives, who owns it, and we can quickly begin to see where there are redundancies or gaps in our flow of information. Okay. So now that we've understand what we have, we want to make it work for us. So in our as-is inventory, we could see those redundancies with the content or gaps when it's aligned to the business processes. So to support the culture and a modern learner, we want to make sure that we have an optimal learning and document approach that's commensurate with risk. So by that I mean, if I have a high risk process area, I might want an e-learning and an SOP. For a lower risk process area, I might want just a learning module. We're also taking into account sort of the balancing act of what knowledge is required, what's the experience of those it's required, of what's the target size of that audience, and the complexity of the process. Those are all components, and of course there's compliance and regulation requirements that are baked into our risk assessments. So an effective documentation strategy ensures that the documentation represents the actual process. It's easy to understand and follow, has the right level of controls. So that means it could be required in a validated environment. It has a review and approval workflow. It has change control history within the documentation. So that's what I mean by that. And it's consistent from one process to the next. So in order to do that, we have a document hierarchy. There's SOPs and policies. There's guidance documents and manuals. There's work instructions and forms. So that's what I mean by consistent. Okay, so here's the money slide. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here. So this is what I've just talked through in terms of our KM design is these connection points. So I talked about the knowledge mapping. That's where I met with those subject matter experts. I met with those business process owners, training, IT, etc. And we identified what were the documents, what were the training activities, what were the other resources sort of out there in SharePoint land that you have that you direct your users to. All of that data was built into our inventory, the knowledge map. That knowledge map, we've been able to upload, more or less, into a knowledge hub. The knowledge hub that we use, it's called IServer. It's a process management system. It's Visio based, but those processes, the level 1, level 2, level 3, they each have attributes, the roles, the systems, the inputs, the outputs. But we've also been able to, by uploading that knowledge map, create attributes called knowledge objects. Those knowledge objects are tagged to each process area because we've already done that in the knowledge mapping to say, this is your L1, L2, L3 process. These are all the resources that you need. Now we want the visual representation of how do those things connect with the process models themselves. So we've done that within the process management system. Then we're able to easily push that data out in a consumable way. That could be customer sites, that could be reports, or that could be the process flows themselves. Because we have any number of users. We've got our customers, of course, our users, the ones that are described within the process in terms of the global regulatory lead does an activity and hands it off to clinical development, who then hands it off to a labeling specialist, so on and so forth. So those individuals, those users, those staff members certainly need to consume that data. And then we have the business process owners who are accountable for those processes and certainly any future impact analyses that they would do for a continuous process improvement, annual, biennial review, a periodic review cycle, or any maturity assessments. So, okay, I just talked through that. I'm going to skip over this one. Uh-oh. Okay. What slide are you seeing? I'm getting a little bit of lag. Are you seeing point of use consumption example?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so this is our customer site. So this is how we've pushed out the data. Now, I'm sure there's a lot more that we could do in terms of making it aesthetically pleasing, the portal page that we've got on the right-hand side. But what I really want you to focus on is the functionality, the architecture. So, okay, so we've got the L1 business process area. That's this page. The L2s, we've got each described there. But then I want to know, what's the executable process? What are all the control documents, the training, the websites, the external resources that I need to know? So that's what's appearing in the big green box there on the far right. That's filterable. That allows users to say, okay, I only want to know about these 2 process areas rather than the collection of process areas. And then the executable processes only show those assets. Another feature that we've included was this contribute knowledge. You can see that about middle of the page on the right-hand side where it says contribute information. We knew that when we went through knowledge mapping that we weren't going to get everything, that there would be inevitably some additional quick reference card or FAQ or some other asset that sort of made its way through our initial search. So we wanted to give Joe Cubicle or whoever created that document the opportunity to contribute it and promote it within these sites. So by clicking on that contribute information, Joe Cubicle could upload or provide us with a hyperlink to those assets and resources, It allows the business process owner to review it and say, we already have something like this. This is redundant. Or, hey, this is really great. Let's make sure it's associated to and then visible here on the portal. Okay, the same information is also another point of use consumption example is by going to the process models themselves. We know that users consume data in different ways, and there was not going to be a one-size-fits-all. We needed to sort of push the data in multiple ways. So this way allows sort of process-based thinkers to come into the Visio based system and click on the process areas, drill down to whatever level of the process area they're interested in, and then see those resources and assets, those knowledge objects per activity. So here you can see, okay, on the left, you can see sort of in the big circle, a number of what look like little laptops and some words below them. Each of these are knowledge objects or the assets that we had discovered during the knowledge mapping. So from this system, the user can click on any one of those and it will launch the document. That's at a high level. That might be at an L1. Over to the right, this is where a user went down to the L3. So they want to know, I have a specific activity that I'm supposed to do. I don't want to know everything that I might need to know. I want to know exactly what I need to know. So that little graduation cap, a user can click on that and get to the PDF or the Word document or whatever it's pointing to. It can bring up the true source. The last example of our point of use consumption are through reports. Now, our reports leave a lot, there's a lot to be desired there. It's not the most beautiful thing, but it's a report out through Tableau. You know, we've organized them based on the risk assessments. That's why you see red, yellow, green. And the process areas, and then their associated process knowledge, what type they are. And again, they link directly to the materials. Now, I'll give you a recent example. We have an inspection and an audit coming up. I was just dealing with that this morning, and we needed to know what's in scope for the inspection is, you know, XYZ process area. We needed to know very quickly, what are all the controlled documents? What are all the training materials associated to that process area that we can supply the inspector and auditor with? We were able to pull up these reports, essentially sort of print them out and hand them over. So, you know, not only does it have an end user benefit, but it certainly has other benefits as well. So looking ahead, there's a lot more that we want to do here. We're particularly interested at this stage in getting those knowledge assets and understanding each of those knowledge objects down to the role level. We've been very focused on, you know, what are the big process areas, level 1, which is really high, level 2, a little lower, L3, that's where our detail is. But within the L3, there are roles. I think I rattled off a few by example, like a global regulatory lead, a you know, GDO staff, a global development operations staff, different individuals. We want to know at an individual level, what are all the assets that they need? So this is definitely on our horizon for this year to get job-specific views. Another thing are these enabling roles. So we know the relationship between roles. So if an individual clicks on a knowledge asset, we can very quickly tell them, you know, other similar roles looked at these assets you might be interested in. So that is in the works as well. And then, of course, automated linking is certainly something that we want to do. So we've gone through sort of the heavy lifting of knowledge mapping and building relationships between those knowledge assets and the process areas. But we want to know as those things are getting uploaded into SharePoint, sort of how they might connect. So we want suggestions back based on that machine learning. Of course, we want to understand sort of how we're doing. So going back to that initial question of how do you measure effectiveness and performance? We want to be able to capture those metrics and analytics sort of automatically from the system, because we've built into Tableau. You know, we do have some data there. So we're looking at how we might gather that data more effectively and supply it to leadership. So I have plowed through that. I'm going to pause there and see if you guys have any comments, questions, if you want me to go back. Let me know.
Hi, Carol. This is Rhonda.
Hi.
Just wanting to catch that last part. The hardest thing I found was the metrics, you know, capturing the measurement for success to determine. We know we have a problem. Most of us seem to start at the same point, capturing all of these things that have just been floating forever. Now we're actually maturing by capturing it, linking it, getting the maps in place. But how do we go about measuring the success? Do you look at surveys, maybe some details from some of your tools, capturing some of that data and using it as a collective group to measure and maybe develop a KPI? Or I don't know, how are you thinking? I know this is your next steps, but.
Yeah, I mean, so initially we have gone back. So when I started, when we were sort of at the point of just really understanding what the problem was to start, I had conducted a survey with the clinical development staff. And, you know, where I was hearing back, I'm spending average of 10 hours a week searching for content or subject matter experts. That's a considerable amount of time spent, all of which has an associated dollar figure too. So I have gone back and resurveyed those individuals, and we've seen a significant reduction in how much time they're spending. That's obviously a positive. We've also seen an increase in terms of, let me go, well, I'll just speak to it. The other thing that came back as the survey, the initial survey, was 60% of that content wasn't in the SOP. It was in all these other tools and resources that were sort of in SharePoint, in Box, in people's desktops, in email, etc. That's not ideal, because if an inspector or an auditor comes in, you know, I'm in a highly regulated space. I need to be able to produce those materials. If I don't know where they are, we're going to get cited for that. So we wanted to increase the reliance of those SOPs and how often staff are going to those versus, you know, quick reference cards, FAQs, or whatever was being produced by, you know, Joe Cubicle. So so we did see an increase because that knowledge mapping allowed us to look at, you know, where are there redundancies? Where's there gaps in information? Where is knowledge not described? Or what process activities are not described in knowledge assets? So we have seen an increase. Sort of one example, I'm going to shut my door because I have a landscaper outside. You're going to hear a leaf blower in a second. Okay, all right. So one of the sort of more funny stories, I guess, when I was knowledge mapping, and this probably won't come as a surprise to the folks on the phone, I went through one of the process areas and we found 300 PowerPoint decks describing the same thing. But this is not surprising necessarily because, you know, someone created a deck and then they shared it to a different audience. They needed to tailor it just slightly, so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden you have 300 decks. Well, you find those decks, you don't know which is the latest. You don't know what's reliable content. You're going to end up working with something that's out of date. We're going to get dinged on that too from an auditor and inspector because it negatively affects performance. They're using something that's out of date or something that's out of alignment with the SOP. We've got a problem. So by increasing the reliable content within the SOP, decreasing this other sort of external materials, that was a big win for us. So that was that's certainly a measurement that's meaningful for management in our space. So that was a long way of answering your question, Rhonda, but hopefully I got there.
Yep, you sure did. Thank you.
Good.
Carol, there's a question in the chat from Paul. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see the chat window?
Let me go to it. Can I go to it? More chat there.
There you go.
Found it. Am I the system owner for IServer, or is there someone else that manages that system? I am not the system owner. My dear friend and oh my goodness, he's a genius, Joe Williams at Amgen. He is the system owner for IServer. He is also what should I say? He is our gatekeeper of all things process change control. So if someone's trying to wiggle something through that doesn't adhere to our governance, he's not going to let it through, which is awesome. So I would be happy to put you in contact with him afterwards, if that's okay. But I can answer some questions. I am in and out of that system all day long.
Thank you, Carol. This is Paul. Now I'll just I'll link up with you on LinkedIn and
Okay.
looking forward to engaging with Joe. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really great system. The reason we chose IServer to house this knowledge mapping data was because we were able to essentially code the system based on our requirements. There's some others, you know, there's quite a few process management systems. Signavio is a really great one, but it really didn't allow us to create and define new attributes that we wanted to. We also have Viva Vault for our document management system. We've of course got learning management systems as well. And each of those are true sources for other content, but I wanted to show sort of the relationship between all of them. So IServer allowed us to essentially create both an interface for those systems as well as a database so that we could push it out to the customer sites, reports, etc. So anyway, Joe's a great resource. I look forward to connecting you too.
Hey, Carol. This is Victor. I'm also interested in the IServer. A lot of things you talked about in that environment kind of hit on what we're trying to get to in my current environment. I just don't think that a lot of our document inventory or knowledge inventory is maybe as mature yet as what you identified as what you chose to start with in that system. But I was interested in knowing about how you labeled things with those connections for the knowledge objects you talked about, and if the documentation that you chose was mature enough that a lot of those connections were already known and how they relate to the business, or if that was a big effort in order to figure that out so that everything in your document and inventory could be used in that system for the users. So I talk about that as the common vocabulary that we use. So how was that effort for you, and what was that like?
So this was definitely a journey. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We started with process management. So understanding and defining what are those process areas, what are the activities within those processes. So, very quickly those were done, through SIPOC models, but we were also understanding sort of what are the process connections so that we could really see an end-to-end process rather than just a segment of the process. Now, that was done within IServer. So we had the naming convention for each of those processes. And, a lot of that is sort of industry standard for us. So we had a framework, but there were some Amgen nuances that we had to capture within that system. And because we had the process flow, so I had the flow of work, but then I wanted to come in and put the flow of knowledge on top of that. So I wanted to overlay the two. Whatever Joe tells you, it's a lie, because I spent 2 years convincing him that this made sense. And he fought me hard on this, but I could not separate process management and knowledge management. The two worked. Is that too loud? Can you hear the leaf blower? Okay. I could see the relationship between, it's too loud for me, hang on. Okay, so I could see the relationship between the process architecture and the knowledge architecture, but sort of how did we bring those together? So the knowledge objects is really just a fancy way of saying input or output, more or less in the system. So that's how we, that was the sort of the technical aspect of the relationship itself.
Right. Yeah. The hits on the SIPOC diagrams and inputs and outputs, that's exactly what I'm trying to get out of our users so that we can do the tagging. Another follow-on would be how did you find how easy were the answers coming? Like, did you find out that you had to train users to talk in that language so that you could get the answers from the business, or did a central authority just kind of take over and say, this is what you are and we're labeling your stuff?
No. Fantastic question. So Jamie and I we've had conversations over the years about sort of being a knowledge practitioner in stealth mode. I could not come in and use the language. I couldn't say terms like knowledge mapping. We're going to sit down and we're going to do a knowledge map. We're going to, we're going to talk about our communities of practice and who those are. I just could not use those terms. I had to go in and sit down and sort of walk them through. When you execute on this activity within the process, what are the controlled documents that you refer to? What are the training courses that you go into LMS and sign up to take? What's on your training transcripts? Then I had to ask the questions, sort of, what's the risk of when you execute this activity, if you don't do it precisely, what happens? So I had to meet the business where they were. I also found a champion early on that
Can I ask you about that risk part? What were you trying to get for the tagging effort?
Yeah, what I was trying to understand, well, what was my residual risk? So if I had 300 PowerPoint decks, I have a greater risk because I have too much content that's either going to be out of alignment, is redundant and confusing to staff. That will increase my risk if I have too much of this other stuff. So it certainly encouraged those business process owners to take a hard look at those knowledge maps and say 299 of those need to go away because I'm increasing my risk. So I had to come at it from a perspective of risk, and then they were more than willing at that point to have the conversation with me.
Okay.
But I started the conversation with, we're going to knowledge map. No one bought into that conversation.
I feel you there. Yep. Okay. I'm sure I'm coming up with more questions, but I'll pause here before I try and take over too much time.
That's fine.
Tammy has a question in the chat, Carol.
Oh. Tableau reports to be desired. I would like to make those Tableau reports a little bit more intuitive. I think, like IServer, it requires some understanding or some ability to manipulate those systems to get to what I need. So within IServer, I have to sort of understand the process architecture. I have to understand business process management notation, the chevrons, a plus symbol means this, I'm going to click on it, so on and so forth. In Tableau, I'd have to sort of select the filter that I want to display the data that I want. So I'm not crazy about them. They are certainly a point of consumption with its own set of users, like the auditor and inspector example that I gave. An analyst was able to go in, sort of do a quick filter, get the data that they needed, and hand it off to the inspector and auditor quickly. Someone within the business that just wants to know, I'm in this role, what knowledge assets do I need? They might not want to go to Tableau and understand how to do that. They might not want to go to IServer. They might want to just go to SharePoint because that's what they're comfortable and familiar with. So that's what I mean by there's a lot to be desired there, just because I think it requires some appreciation of sort of how Tableau works. That could also be just in the report design itself too, but thanks for the question.
This is Turo Dexter. I have a question about the genesis of KM and process management coming together.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history in your organization, like who came first, or were you both out there doing your own thing? How did you meet? Was it love at first sight?
No.
How'd that go?
So process management came first. Well, I should say document management was always there. Training was always there. Process management came along because we were finding that, SOPs, so these standard operating procedures, would get written. 6 weeks later, the author would come back and say, I need to revise something. We'd revise it. 2 months later, they'd come back and revise it again. And so we started to ask the question, do you even know what your process should be doing? We also found that systems were being implemented across the organization that did not support the business process. We were starting to change our processes to meet the system requirements when it really should have come opposite way around. But understanding the business process first, build, use that as a case study to understand what your requirements, your system requirements are. So those things came first and foremost. Then it was an alignment between how do we take those business processes and align the documents. Do the business process models, the Visio diagrams, and the SOPs, do they say the same thing? Because you have a Visio file and a Word document, you would expect that sort of step 2A1 does the same thing as sort of just visually depicted in the process model. So that happened, that relationship. And then we did the same thing with training. And then, like I said, and then I had to sort of convince the system owner of IServer to sort of see those connections, that we have a process model and we have a SOP that describes that process. Don't we want to relate those two things? We have an e-learning that describes how to execute on some of those activities. Don't we want to relate those two things, or those now 3 things? Then we've got quick reference cards out in SharePoint. Don't we want to relate those things? So it was definitely, like I said, a journey, mostly because we needed to bring the business along with this to get away from a document-centric view, but a holistic process-based view. Again, because it's end-to-end thinking, not just one process, you know, a segment of the process at a time. Because, you know, like most, all of these processes are cross-functional. I'm going to hand off my output is going to get handed off to the next process or the next role, the next system. I need to sort of describe that whole handoff or that series of handoffs. So as a result, you know, by understanding the process clearly, aligning the documents, the training, so on and so forth, we were able to sort of mature the business with us. Sorry for this background noise.
We don't hear it at all.
Okay.
We don't hear it.
I do.
It's probably really annoying to you, but we don't hear it, Carol.
Very loud. I'm so sorry. Okay, good. I'm glad.
We only hear you. Corey has a follow-on question here, and then I think we probably have time for maybe one more question.
As an umbrella, I absolutely, Corey, would consider KM as an umbrella to process management. Process management, the communities of practice, though we call those networks at Amgen, they own the processes. They are the owners for all of those assets, or they are accountable to all of those. So they are accountable. They are the owners of the documents themselves. They're not always the system owners, but they certainly do have a level of decision-making rights when it falls in their process area. So I would definitely consider it as an umbrella.
I was wondering, out of curiosity, what do you do with the 300 PowerPoints in a situation like this? No, I mean, in a sense that, do you keep them? Do you give explanations like this is like if you go to a certain client, or if you a presentation that is more internal, or do you give some tags, or just clear and just keep one standard?
You know, in a lot of cases, we were able to just archive or retire that content. But to your point, there will always be examples where, you know, you're going to one group and you want to present to them. You go to a next group, you want to present sort of a slightly tailored presentation of that. So we did make sure that we have the ability to tag them accordingly. You know, what's process, what's a process asset versus you know, an additional resource.
Thanks. Wonderful. Were there any other questions? Those are all great questions, by the way. All right. Well, thank you so much, Carol, for your presentation. It was fantastic. And if we were in person, we would have a lovely certificate to give to you, but I'm just going to have to send it to you via email. But thank you so much for taking the time today to share all that with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know, I think it's just so great that we're able to connect. It just opens up so much more when we're able to do this online and not just in Arlington. And then I also wanted to say hi to Judy and Jim Lee, who I met a long time ago, who popped in while you were in the presentation. I think Mary Little from our office also popped in, but I want to say hi to them too. So we got started, or you were already in process when they joined, but thanks for joining us today, guys.
Yes, and thank you to everybody who's here for the first time, because this is like our 84th meeting of this group, Knowledge Management Community of DC, and we're still going stronger now because we have a board, and I hope you're enjoying it. And please come to the next meeting. We have been doing a pretty good job of meeting every month and spreading the knowledge management word. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching KMCDC's presentation. Hope to see you at the next monthly meeting.